Hello, debaters. So today we are going to be talking about the evidence for the counterplan. So we're going to start on the neg side, and then we're going to look at the affirmative responses. That way we can lay out the negative story and then go to what the affirmative says in response. Just like we talked about in the last video about the structure and story, we're going to start by talking about what the counterplan text is, and then counterplan solvency, then the net benefit that the counterplan gets, that the negative gets to run when they run the counterplan, and then some permutation arguments for both sides. So let's get right into it. So we're going to start with the negative, like I said. Your file should look like this, right? Should have really like 10 pages or less. It's not very long. The argument explanation is really important. The argument explanation that's written in here is going to tell you how to use this. So even if you don't watch this full video, even if you didn't watch the other two videos or the next video, you'll understand what to do with this counterplan if you read that. This is just to follow up on that. So in the last video, we talked about a bunch of examples of what we could have for text for the counterplan. But you only actually get one text in the debate. So you're not allowed to make up other texts or change this one or do anything. This is the only one you have, right? So you need to understand it, you need to understand what it does and be ready to use it, because it's really important for the negative strategy if you're going to use this counterplan. So the counterplan text is: each of the 50 states should pass a law banning all non-tactical police from carrying or using firearms while on duty. So it's pretty much exactly the same as the affirmative. It has the same outcome, which is that police no longer use firearms when they're on the job, or just like don't receive them, right? The majority of police anyway. The only difference is that instead of the national government doing it, now the state governments do it. So that's the thing we're going to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this story and the rest of this evidence. It's going to help us tell the story and make the argument that having the states do it instead of having the federal government do it is a better idea. So let's look at the first piece of solvency evidence. I think there's two pieces of solvency. Is that right? Yep, two pieces of solvency. Okay, first piece of solvency evidence from Daniel Nichanian. Nichanian. I'm going to say Nichanian, 2020. This one says that states solve problems better than the federal government because they can be more specific and responsive to their communities. So this looks at, a bunch of different states. It says, okay, how does the politics in each state break down? Are they Republican, Democrat, how far to which side? And then it based on the way that the politics are in each state, it makes the claim that, okay, because the state government is in charge of less people and it knows their people much better, and those people, vote more consistently for one party or the other, the state government has a better idea of what its citizens want than the national government, because the national government has to cover everybody, right? But the state government only has to respond to the people in the state, right? So theoretically, it should have a better idea of what's going on locally in the state itself and how to respond to that problem and how to solve it. So if you think of like a criminal justice reform issue in real life, when you think about like the responses to the George Floyd murder, right? So you have like the city response, the state response, and then the national response. The city government, depending on when this video comes out or when you watch it, at least in December 2020, they've at least considered making some pretty substantial changes to defunding the police, major changes. I don't know if that's actually going to happen or not, but that type of response, like defunding the police, putting that money into other social service programs, building up other programs to replace policing with more like community safety, community social safety net type programs. That's something that maybe could happen in Minneapolis because of the people who live here and the will to get it done in the city. But as you go outside Minneapolis to like the suburbs or to, greater Minnesota, there's no way that's going to happen out there, right? And then when you think about the whole country, there's no way that that's going to happen across the whole country, right? Because most of the rest of the country, most of the rest of the state just isn't ready for that type of change. And even though it was something that happened here that had a big impact here, that impact isn't necessarily felt as much the further you get away from Minneapolis, right? So that supports this argument by saying, these things that happen locally, local governments are more likely to deal with them in a way that makes sense for the community. And the further you get away from local governments, the more likely you are to have just like a one size fits all policy that doesn't really, like, it might make sense in one place, but doesn't really make sense everywhere else, right? So therefore, the state governments can react more appropriately to their state than the national government can. Okay, next one. So this is from Casey Leins. Leins, I'm going to say it's Leins, could be Leins, I guess, but I think it's Leins, 2019. It says the states solve better than the federal government because they tend to be ahead of the federal government in terms of effective and fair criminal justice reform policy. So basically what that means is that the states have been more progressive in passing laws about criminal justice that are less harsh, or, help people recover and rehabilitate so that they can go back into society and also not be a threat to society. And basically this piece of evidence just goes through a bunch of examples, all of which are really good, but you don't need to read every single part of this in a debate. This is a piece of evidence that I would probably highlight down just to make it more efficient, because you don't need to talk about every single example, but each example does help make the case for this argument, right? And in doing the counter plan, if you make the argument that the state governments are generally better about this, then the result, the implication of that is that if you do the counter plan through the states, it's going to be more progressive, it's going to be more effective, it's going to affect a lot more laws and police officers in a way that's likely to, continue over time and be effective. So I think this is an okay piece of evidence. I think this has a lot of evidence, a lot of facts in it, a lot of data in it that's going to help you make the argument you're trying to make. Okay, so that's the solvency. That's why having the states do it instead of the national government is a good idea. Now let's talk about the net benefit, which is if you do the counter plan instead of the affirmative plan, what additional goods does it cause, or what harmful effects does it avoid? So these are both going to be with reference to the state power disadvantage. So if you want to use the counter plan, you have to use the state power disadvantage, in my opinion, in order to have a negative strategy that makes any sense at all. So the first piece of evidence is from Benjamin Purnell in 2019. He says that, criminal justice reform is already a core power of the states. So the counter plan doesn't make states too powerful or the federal government too weak. So if it doesn't change the balance between the state and the federal government, then it doesn't cause things to be out of balance. So it doesn't cause the impact of the disadvantage, right? And that's what you're trying to say here, is that there's no link to the state's power disadvantage. Remember, the story that the state power disadvantage is trying to tell is that things are balanced right now, but passing the affirmative will take too much power away from the states and give it to the national government. And when the national government has power, they do bad things with it. Or at the very least, it's good when the states have power because they do good things with it, right? So if regulating the police is already something that the states do, and Benjamin Purnell says it is, then the counter plan doesn't actually change anything about the way the world is, right? So it doesn't cause the disadvantage, whereas the affirmative does, and the disadvantage is a bad thing. So therefore, doing the counter plan avoids a bad thing that would otherwise happen. And if you read the link evidence, the negative link evidence on the state power disadvantage, it's going to say things that are very similar to this. So you can also use that evidence as an argument. And a lot of the uniqueness evidence too says the same thing, which is, it says states are the ones who regulate the police, not the national government. So those pieces of evidence also help this argument out. So you're going to have a lot of evidence to support that argument. When it comes to the permutation, we're labeled under competition, right? Because the counter plan has to be competitive with the affirmative. You can't be able to do them both at the same time. you want to be able to say you can only do this or you can only do that. The net benefit helps say why, if you try to do them both at the same time, it still causes the net benefit, and also just doesn't solve as well. So one of the piece of explanation you have here, it's not a card, it's just a piece of explanation that you can tell the judge. And since this is already pre-written in, you can't rewrite it, you can't add to it, so leave this as it is. But basically, it just says, the permutation still links to the disadvantage because the permutation still takes power away from the state government's power over policing. Our link cards on the disadvantage show this. The perm will disrupt the balance of power between the states and federal government, which will still cause the impact. When we get to the affirmative arguments, we're going to see exactly what the perm is. But basically, the affirmative perm just says the state government should work together with the national government to do the plan to get rid of firearms from the police. So this permutation says, okay, if you try to do that, if you try to have the national and state governments work together, that's still the national government taking power away from the states. So if that's still the case, maybe it links less to the disadvantage than the case does, but it still links pretty hard. And the counterplan doesn't link at all to the disadvantage. So it's still preferable to do the counterplan rather than to do the plan or the permutation. And then you also have this piece of evidence from Marcus Hawkins. He says that the permutation does not solve better than the counterplan because federal government gets in the way of local reforms. So this is a solvency argument, right? He's saying even if the national and state governments work together to do the plan, that's not a good thing because it creates more levels of bureaucracy and problems that, both sides have to fight through to come to the outcome of taking firearms away from police officers. So if that's the case, that, they don't work very well together, there's no reason to have them work together. Just have the states do it or have the national government do it. There's no reason to go together, right? So those are all the negative arguments. I think you can see that, like we talked about in the last video, the really important thing here is you have to establish basically three things. One, that the counterplan solves the case solves the affirmative as well as the affirmative, or even better, maybe a little bit less as well, but not too much. Second, that the affirmative causes the state power disadvantage, whereas the negative does not cause the state power disadvantage through counterplan. And then third, that the national government and the state governments should not work together on trying to take firearms away from the police officers. So if you establish those three things, you're definitely going to win this debate as the negative, right? The real problem is in the actual debate itself, you have to kind of pay attention and make sure you know what arguments the affirmative is making against you so you can respond to them correctly. And then that you know which arguments that the affirmative didn't respond to so that you can extend them and explain them to the judge. Super easy. Okay, let's go on to the affirmative. So once again, I really strongly suggest you read the argument explanation at the top. It's super important. It's going to give you even more than this video will, and you can always go back to it and reread it if it doesn't really make sense. So assuming that you've read it, let's get into the evidence itself. The affirmative arguments are going to be basically a mirror to the negative arguments, right? So we talked about those four things for the negative. The affirmative is going to talk about four pieces that are in direct conflict with it. So for the solvency answers, the first one we have is from Wray, he's actually like a really important writer, especially in MMT, modern monetary theory, and like governance stuff. So he's like a really good writer, very important author from 2019. He says that state governments are too slow to act and don't act in the best interest of their communities. And he sort of looks at about 70 years of history, and he says, okay, looking at these 70 years of history, yeah, there's a few states that are progressive and have done a really good job responding to their communities. But in general, states have been way behind on a lot of these issues and haven't been very good about solving problems in their states, especially when those problems tend to affect like people of color or people who are economically less well off, or people who are, like immigrants or not, maybe undocumented, stuff like that, right? So Randall Wray is making a really good argument that when it comes to topics like this, criminal justice, other progressive topics, just because a few states have done a really good job doesn't mean they all do a good job. And the only way to get states to uniformly do something good is to have the national government pass a plan or a law that has it happen. So that's a pretty good answer to the counterplan, because it's basically saying, even if you pass this law through the states, are they really going to enforce it? Is it really going to be that strong of a law? Are they really going to go all the way out and make sure it's done correctly? Randall says maybe not. Second one we have is from BBC News 2020. Says that state governments don't do nearly as much as national governments to solve problems. So yeah, this basically talks about, when we think about state governments, just because one state passes a law doesn't mean that other states pass that same law, or a law that's as strong, or a law that solves the problem in the same way. You don't have that problem with the national government, right? When the national government passes a law, everybody from all the states has to do it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, right? You just do it. So this makes the argument that you would want either the affirmative to have the national government pass the plan, or you'd want to do the permutation to have the national government involved in passing the plan, because that way you're going to have a strong law at the top, and that all the states are going to have to conform to that really strong law. So that's a good argument for the affirmative, for sure. Okay, now we're going to talk about the net benefit. So the affirmative has to make the case that the counterplan either causes the disadvantage to happen, or that the affirmative plan also does not cause the disadvantage to happen, or you could even say both. Since this is in the counterplan arguments, this is going to be making the argument that the counterplan, the negative counterplan, also causes the disadvantage to happen. So if the affirmative causes the disadvantage to happen and the negative causes the disadvantage to happen, then for the judge, there's no net benefit, right? It's just, you're just thinking about which one solves the problem outlined by the 1AC better, but you're not really concerned with the state power disadvantage. So Timothy Callaghan, 2018, he says, the counterplan throws the balance of power too far in the favor of states, which means that the impact turns to the disadvantage apply to the counterplan. And basically, he goes through, he talks about a few historical examples. He talks about nullification, which you may have heard of if you have taken history courses so far about the Civil War. And that's basically where the states, where the national government tried to pass some laws to regulate them, such as ending slavery. And the state government said, no, we don't agree. We don't think that the national government has the power to tell states what to do. So those laws you passed, we're just going to nullify them, or just pretend they don't exist, right? And that was not a very good thing. It turns out the state governments should not have done that. And the reason that they flexed their powers was not for good reasons, right? It wasn't to help solve climate change or help solve social issues. It was to keep some pretty bad social policies in place and to keep some bad economic policies in place, right? So state power, when states have been too strong, they have used it for bad things before. And that is what the impact turns to the disadvantage say, right? The affirmative has some arguments against the disadvantage that basically say, when the states are too strong, they do bad stuff, and the national government has to be strong to do good stuff. So if that's the case, then basically what this argument is saying is, okay, if the disadvantage is true, if it's the case that the plan would take powers away from the states and the counterplan would give powers to the states, then that's bad, because the counterplan giving powers to the states is what led to things like nullification, continuing slavery, stopping segregation, things like that. So I think this is a pretty good piece of evidence. I think this piece of evidence goes really well with the answers to the disadvantage. And again, like we talked about in the last video, if you're the affirmative, you have to make a choice, right? You have to choose how you're going to beat the counterplan. Are you going to say, the counterplan doesn't solve it? It links to the disadvantage, and the disadvantage doesn't link to the case. Basically, play defense. Or are you going to play some offense? Are you going to say, you know what? We do cause the disadvantage to happen. We take power away from the states when we pass the plan, but that's a good thing because states are bad. And basically, if you take that option, you're going all in on states are bad, national government's good. And then you can read things like, the solvency answers. You can read these net benefit answers. You can read the impact turns to the disad. I personally think that second option is better, to go all offense. But you should talk to your coach and figure out what makes more sense for you. Okay, and then finally, we have the permutation. So the permutation for the affirmative is that the state and federal government should work cooperatively to ban all non-tactical police officers from using or carrying firearms while on duty. So, in the 1AC, you initially said state government or federal government should do it. Negative counterplan says state government should do it. Permutation says both should do it together. They should work together. The reason this is that this permutation avoids the link to the disadvantage because the perm still leaves most of the power to decide how to do policing enforced to the states, which means their links to the disadvantage don't apply to the permutation, and you could still pass the plan. And then you have a piece of evidence from the Pew Charitable Trust from 2018. And they basically say criminal justice reform works better when national and state governments work together. And it has some data and historical examples about how that's true. So the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about strategy and how we talked about already the two options you have and how to make those options work. But I hope that this makes sense in terms of looking at the actual evidence itself, and that you should choose which option makes sense to you. Read the evidence and then be ready to present the evidence and your argument to tell your story that the judge should either pass this counterplan because it solves better than the affirmative and doesn't cause a disadvantage, or that the judge shouldn't pass the counterplan because it doesn't solve the problem and it does cause a disadvantage, or that the counterplan doesn't solve the problem and also gives too much power to the states and then bad things happen. Either way, take some time to read through this evidence, talk to your coaches, do some highlighting, and make sure that you know which strategy you're going to try before the debate starts. So you can have a nice, smooth debate that everybody learns from. And it's clear for you and the judges, which is really important. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.